Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Well, history goes on around us all the time. There are those events that coalesce both the forward and backward march of that story. With respect to the civil rights movement, events such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, Bloody Sunday, and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church were all such events. And now we can add to that litany the death of George Floyd and the protests throughout the country. Like those previous events, it has, in a very 21st century way, rapidly galvanized and shifted public opinion about both race and policing. Few are more attuned to all of this than black police officers who sit astride two worlds. It gives them a unique perspective, and one that we're going to try and understand today, as I'm joined on this week's Who, What, Why podcast by Lieutenant Ben Kelso, a high-ranking member of the San Diego Police Department and the president of the San Diego Black Police Officers Association. It is my pleasure to welcome Lieutenant Ben Kelso to the Who, What, Why podcast. Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me. I appreciate having an opportunity to really discuss some of the issues here.
First of all, talk a little bit about your background. You've been on the force for over 30 years. Give us a little sense of that, because certainly in 30 years you've seen a lot change, a lot happen.
We've definitely experienced a lot of change over 30 years. When I started, we barely had radios that worked. They were not what we have now. And, you know, we've seen other technology come into play, you know, cell phones now and cameras and everything else, all kinds of specialized equipment, tasers, and you name it. Right. And we didn't have a lot of those things when I first started. They gave you a gun and handcuffs and a stick. And that's pretty much all you had. If you need to talk to somebody, you had a call box key you could go make a phone call on.
Given all of those changes, so many of them around technology, how have they changed policing in terms of the fundamental work that police do, their role in the community, their involvement in dealing with crime and community relations? With all the technology that's changed, there's some fundamental parts of the job, it seems, that have always been the same.
You know, technology has made a huge impact on the job. A lot of it for the better, mainly for the better. Some of it, not so much. It's up to interpretation, I suppose. But I will tell you that technology has strengthened officers' abilities to do the job, but the basic things that go with the work aren't technology-based. And one of the biggest things about being in law enforcement and being a police officer is being able to problem solve and being able to really kind of mediate out situations with people. And that really comes from your interpersonal skills and not so much what you're wearing on your utility belt.
What have you seen in the past 30 years in terms of individuals that choose to go into police work? As you look at your colleagues through all of these years, what's changed in terms of the type of people that come into the force?
Well, I'll tell you that people coming into law enforcement today are a lot more educated. They tend to be a little bit older now coming in. Some of them are coming in from having previous careers. And now law enforcement is becoming a second career for them. Back when I came in, officers were usually in their early 20s or so, and they had some life experience, were out on their own with their families and trying to make it on their own. And this became a really good career to raise your family on. Nowadays, like I said, it's a secondary career, and it's not often one that people are choosing now because they have a lot more options because of their education.
As a result of that, how has it changed the nature of the attitudes of the people that decide to be police officers?
We're certainly influenced heavily by social media today. I think all the new recruits that come in, they have a heavy social media presence that has to be monitored and checked as part of the background process to see if they have activities in their lives or things in their lives that may not make them good fits for law enforcement. So that's really important. We look for people who have the ability to one, persevere in the face of a lot of negativity, especially negativity directed specifically at them when they show up to solve problems and they want to solve problems anyway. People that have a desire to help people that have a desire to really do good in their communities in spite of the things that are purported out in the communities about law enforcement, about police. Some communities love police, and other communities have a real lukewarm or maybe even difficult relationship with the police. And we look for people that can overcome those things and come and do the job and work late nights, long hours, and be hungry and put up with a lot of verbal abuse sometimes physical, right? But they generally do the right thing. Generally. We still have problems. We're not perfect. And there are officers out there that get themselves into situations where they do the wrong thing. And agencies have got to learn to hold those folks accountable. And if necessary, remove those people from the job because they are really creating bigger problems for the rest of the law enforcement officers that are out there trying to do the right thing.
Is there more diversity in your police force and police forces in general today? And why does that matter?
Well, I would say that sometimes diversity is really hard to come by in law enforcement. It really depends on your region and your area. And of course, law enforcement today has a goal of trying to have departments that reflect their communities, but that isn't so easily done, especially when you start talking about minority communities and Black communities in general, where there's a stigma in those communities about law enforcement and a real negative view towards having their children and their friends and their loved ones become members of law enforcement because of that negative attitude. Other regions and other agencies where there are larger pools of minorities, they find it easier to have a diverse department. But overall, if you look nationwide, it's still largely dominated by, white men for the most part around the country. And I without pointing fingers at any individual agency, just looking at policing in general, we still need to work on diversifying it because it will make people in those minority communities feel better about policing. There's more trust involved sometimes when someone shows up to your door that looks like you, right? Right, wrong, or indifferent. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. I'm able to walk into some circles and to handle some calls just basically on the premise that I look like the person that's dealing with the trauma or whatever situation that the officers are responding to, right? Some of those walls come down just by me being there. I'm trained the same way as the other guy, but people sometimes are just more comfortable dealing with people that look like them, especially in those moments where, they're in crisis and there's things going on in their lives that law enforcement has to get involved in.
Which really raises a question that we've been hearing a lot of these days with respect to funding and what police departments do, which is, are the police called on to do too much, particularly in the realm of social services, areas that should be done by other agencies as opposed to the police?
I certainly agree with that. I believe that law enforcement officers and policing in general are called upon to do too much. I can tell you that in my 30 years, we do a lot more today than we did before. Originally, it was just kind of be about law enforcement and crime prevention. But that role has expanded. And, now, we're dealing with mental health issues and trying to deliver services to homeless or unsheltered people and trying to be everything for everyone, right? And then at what point, what are we good at anymore? What do we really specialize in? Police wind up being the entry point for access to government services, and maybe that's not the best use of law enforcement.
One of the things we've certainly heard a lot about in the past couple of weeks is systemic racism in police departments in this country. What have you seen in San Diego and in neighboring communities in California?
Well, the whole point of systemic racism really is more of the collective, what we see collectively nationwide and what we've seen collectively historically involving policing. And it takes us back before the civil rights era, and even back to, slavery before the Civil War, where we find that people of color in their interactions with law enforcement are not always treated the same way. The results aren't always the same way. And I talk to a lot of people in meetings out in the community, and unfortunately, we've kind of taken a position as law enforcement sometimes that whatever happens, let's say whatever happened in Minnesota, well, that didn't happen here, right? And because it didn't happen here, then we kind of dismiss the feelings that communities have of traumatic law enforcement incidents around the country, right? Without realizing that the Black community is not individualized by cities or by states. There's a greater Black community, so to speak, and I guess that would be nationwide. When an individual gets hurt or killed unjustly, or what the community deems as unjustly by law enforcement in one city, that pain is felt. It's like reverberate across the country in every city, right? And when you start looking at them coming in rapid succession of one another over and over and over and over again for usually seemingly minor crimes that result in an individual's death, that creates a lot of anger, a lot of rage in communities. And the result of that is what we've experienced over the last few weeks, right? Because those incidents seem to happen back to back to back to back. And then you look at another incident, and, they like to bring up Dylan Roof, who shot the parishioners in the church. I think he killed like 9 people, right? And when he stopped as a very peaceful stop. They take him to get him lunch, right? But he was armed and he killed a bunch of people. And then we find, an African-American guy who was selling loose cigarettes. He gets 5 officers on him, and he's dead at the end of that stop for simply selling loose cigarettes, right? And we look at George Floyd in a similar manner. The communities look at that in a much similar manner, that, hey, what was he doing that he had to die from it? Could we have done something differently? So that's the whole systemic. The system seems to condone and support these things continuing to happen. We don't see the other side of that, which is, yes, it was a tragedy, right? There should be some accountability, right? Our officers being held to the same standard that communities are being held to. And of course, there's qualified immunity in law enforcement. But when you have incidents that really show poor judgment, negligence, or, willful indifference that results in a death, should that officer be held to a different standard? Should that qualified immunity apply?
Take us inside the San Diego Police Department, your department, and talk about what it has been like for the past several weeks. One, inside the department in terms of what officers are talking about, and particularly what it's like for you as a Black officer in a predominantly white department.
Well, I will tell you that the department as a whole has felt the stress of the last several weeks. We had officers that worked up to 14 days, 12-hour days with no days off. There's fatigue involved in that, and we felt that. But they've also, banded together to support the city and to protect the city, and that's a good thing. But in their personal conversations with some, all right, because we've seen a massive outpour across the nation, and people are really speaking out, right? And officers are speaking out too, right? And some of those conversations are uncomfortable. And in particular, when we talk about the Black Police Officers Association speaking on issues of race and policing and reform and some of those things, we get a lot of pushback. What's interesting is we get the pushback from outside, externally, when people say, well, hey, when these things happen, what are you doing about it? You're inside. Are you standing by and just watching it happen? Are you trying to make a difference? All right. And that comes externally from communities of color. But internally, we get the other side. Are you siding with the community over us, right? We got a Facebook page and Twitter and Instagram and some of those groups, they're open pages. So we recently have been trying to explain Black Lives Matter and what it means culturally, what it means to us. And there are some in law enforcement that deem it as a terrorist organization. And when you say Black Lives Matter, they counter with all lives matter, but it doesn't mean Black lives. That's the whole point of it all. Black lives have to matter for all lives to matter. And that was the whole point when the founders of this movement, when they put it together, they just wanted police accountability, right? And we struggle with that, police accountability and what that's like. So the BPOA and other organizations like us and, minority officers in general get caught up in the middle sometimes of those arguments, trying to translate those out and mediate those things out because the community and the police don't always speak the same language. So we're kind of like universal translators for that, but we take those hits on both sides. We had a big set of traffic on our Facebook page over a photo that basically showed a Venn diagram that said you could support, you can condemn the murder of George Floyd and you can support good policing. And one other thing it said, and you can do all of those things, right, at the same time, right? It's not a all or one sort of proposition, all or nothing. You can support them all. And there were some individuals that came over and made a couple trolling negative comments that sparked a great deal of activity. And it really demonstrates what we go through trying to do this job, right? Understanding that a lot of us, we come out of these communities that say they're over-policed, all right, and that the police are occupying forces in those communities. They've been known to treat people bad. We come out of those communities. We're here to make a difference, right? And when you start getting it on both sides, it gets really exhausting, really tired.
How does that impact morale? How does it impact your morale and your fellow Black officers in the department to have that pressure on you all the time?
I would say that there are times when it can get pretty rough. Officers, some of our peers that come in, they decide that it's too much for them, and they leave the profession, right? There are others that stay. There's some that decide, maybe it's easier to go work in other parts of the city and not work in communities of color because, the pressure is just too much for them to deal with. What has really kept me going is I have a really strong relationship with a lot of people in this community, and I chose this community to work in. All right, I came out of Detroit, Michigan, and Flint, Michigan, and when I got to San Diego, the southeastern area of the city was the closest to where I came from. So I feel really comfortable here, right? And I immediately started trying to build relationships with people in the community. It didn't matter. You treat I grew up learning that you treat the janitor the same way you treat, the CEO or the boss, So I kind of take that attitude in policing that, hey, I'm out here to do a service. I'm out here to do a job, right? And I want to end every contact with that person understanding that, hey, I treated them well. I did what I had to do, right? But I don't have to demean them. I don't have to treat them bad. I can deliver them to jail. A lot of them over my career ended up thanking me when I got them to jail because, hey, they were delivered there safely, no problems. I didn't look down upon them like, hey, this is the job, right? Sorry, that's just kind of how it goes, right? And when you do that, then, I think the career is a lot more noble. It is for me. So that kind of helps keep me going, especially during these bad times.
Which really begs the question of attitude. There's so much that we're hearing now in terms of policy changes, and all arguably good ones with respect to qualified immunity and chokeholds and militarization of equipment for police departments. So much focused on policy and better training. But at the end of the day, it really does come down to attitude. How do we begin to address that?
Yeah, that's a tough one, how we address attitudes. You know, it could be a part of the process of coming in, the entire screening process coming forward. Right now, you take a written psychological exam. I think it's called the MMPI, right? You take that test, and it's got like 1,000 questions on it or something like that. And then based on that, then you go forward and you talk with a police psychologist, and that person can either give you the nod and you proceed forward in the hiring process, or they can move you out. Like maybe some of those processes need to be updated, right? We certainly need to have ways to get the types of people that we want in law enforcement, to get service-oriented type people, right? And really, the biggest thing I think we could make headway on is the mindset of being a guardian, a servant, a public servant, right? We've taken on a warrior ethos, right? And that really came out of officer safety concerns back over the past few decades. We have a lot of officers killed in the line of duty, and as a result of that, there was a lot of training in the warrior mindset, defensive mindset, right? And I think that we want to balance that out a little bit better.
As you've looked over the years, what has been the impact of popular culture with respect to how police are seen in terms of the public's attitude towards the police and even the police attitude towards themselves, because they've seen themselves portrayed certain ways in the popular culture?
Well, certainly popular culture has an impact on everything, and sadly, we're getting more of it than ever. It used to be you would only get it on television and in the movies, but now it's television, movies, it's on your phone, it's in the social media. You're constantly being bombarded with that, with imagery and all those things that really reflect negatively. And sometimes I think it sets us up for really this false ideal, right? Because we really have a lot of anger, and it's righteous when we find that officers' actions towards people are unjust. But what we really miss is every day officers are going out there and they are doing the right thing, and they are going above and beyond to serve and protect. And that doesn't make popular culture. It's not popular. It's boring, right? But really, every day officers go out and contact people. Hey, the contact is great, right? It's friendly. The people feel like they've been protected. They feel like they've been served, but that isn't what we see. We don't see that. We don't see movies about good cops that are out doing good work. That's not popular, right? And sometimes we see stories. We see stories in the media about officers that are out there doing great things, but those are exceptional things. But, the real bulk of policing is pretty sterile, pretty boring, and there's a lot of good people out doing that work. And it's really sad that they get tarnished by these other incidents where officers have taken action and the outcome has come out bad, whether it's intentional or not.
Is this something that you and your colleagues are talking about now, given that everybody else seems to be talking about it? Is this being talked about inside the department?
Well, it's certainly being talked about inside my organization. We are part of a national organization, and we have these conversations quite frequently. Depending on your agency, the leadership within the agency can reach out and ask for input, kind of check the temperature, so to speak. Sometimes we probably need more of that. We need more collaboration. We need, law enforcement leadership to look at the big picture and take advantage of the different organizations that have relationships in these communities, right, to give them input and insight, right, and help build that bridge between community and law enforcement. I think if we do that more, that will be helpful. We still got to make some changes, though, because it's never going to look good to see an unarmed individual seriously injured or killed when they didn't have to be, and something else could have been done. That's never going to look good. And no matter what we do in law enforcement, we're never going to be able to overcome that. That doesn't mean that situations don't take place where those things happen and, there was nothing else that could be done. But we really do got to take the time to focus on eliminating those ones that don't have to be done.
Are you surprised by the extent of the reaction to the George Floyd killing, the way in which this feels like some kind of moment of change?
I'm not surprised, but I do understand it. I mean, we've experienced this before. We experienced this with Trayvon Martin. We experienced this with Eric Garner. We experienced this with, countless times over the last several decades. I mean, all the way back to Rodney King, we've experienced it before. What's different about this one is we watched it. We watched it happen for almost 10 minutes live, right? And our normal law enforcement response is to, well, let's wait for all the facts. Let's wait for, the investigation to be complete. But when you are a witness, and we were witnesses to it by watching 10 minutes of footage, then, it makes it a lot, it's a lot harder to digest, all right? And it brings up feelings that makes you think about being on the right side of history. It makes you think, wow, that was, no matter what he did not deserve to be handcuffed face down on the ground, right, with 3 officers on him and 1 officer with his knee on his neck while he pled for his life for nearly 10 minutes. And then he died in front of us. And that's traumatic to the whole world. That's why we have this outcry.
The fact that the protests, that the outcry is as diverse as it is today, and certainly that's different than some protests in the past, to what extent does that give you hope that maybe some real change will come from this?
It's actually pretty uplifting to see that there's allyship now, right? That we don't just hear communities of color crying out about abuse, saying, hey, we're not being treated the same. We are being abused by law enforcement, right? And suddenly now, because people saw it and they were just as outraged by it, then they changed. Suddenly now, Colin Kaepernick's peaceful protest against police brutality wasn't about the flag of the military. It never was. But there is a group of people, largely in the nation that, felt that, hey, it was disrespectful to the flag, right? And it was never about the flag. Now you see the NFL has completely did a 180 on it, right? And you see corporate America and everything else, they're all going, hey, maybe we do need to look at this a little bit differently, right? The whole Black Lives Matter movement was simply about police accountability. That's all it's been about. Now, that doesn't mean that in these protest marches there haven't been, atrocities committed. People have been injured and killed, including law enforcement officers, right? But the underlying message is that, hey, people of color aren't feeling valued. And when you say all lives matter, it's only lip service if they continue to see people of color being killed by law enforcement unnecessarily or unjustly.
What can police officers do today to not be so defensive, to not overreact to all the criticism, to realize that something does need to be done, and this is more of an opportunity than something to be defensive about?
A lot of people have to take, personal reflection time. You got to really think about your values, all right, and think about the greater picture. Right now, we're kind of focused on it, at ground level. But when you start to take a look at it from the 10,000 foot level or the balcony level, you get a different view. You get a different understanding of things. And if you can do that and have some empathy and really just kind of listen, right? Listen without judgment. Listen to what's really being said, because a lot of it is nuanced and contextual. We hear things and we say things, and sometimes it's not exactly what we mean. The message isn't being translated properly, right? But what's very clear is that people in this nation are very, very unhappy about what happened, so much that they've been in the streets protesting for 2 weeks. Some of those protests have been violent. Most of them have not. But it's not going away this time. We do have to take stock and make some changes as a law enforcement industry, and we have to make changes in our communities as well.
However, the problem again and again is the defensiveness that prevents so many of your colleagues inside departments from opening up and allowing some of these ideas to come in.
It's all or nothing. It's really a really difficult, because you can't convince them about it. Just listen, just wait. We have other perspectives, and they're just as valid, right? But in law enforcement, we're like zero-sum game sort of people. It's black and white on everything, and it's not. Everything is really gray, whole lot of gray. And what's funny is law enforcement officers are actually people who deal in gray every day, right? Do you write this ticket or not? Do you stop that person or not? Who do you talk to? Well, there's that person or this. You know what I mean? There's a lot of variation in what they do and how they make decisions, right? But they have a really hard time attributing to that sort of thinking to this conversation, to the conversations about race and about, profiling and just, communities of color in general, right? And how they got set up and people not recognizing that we've only had 56 years since the passing of the Civil Rights Act, right? There's 400 years of slavery, another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. We have 56 years since passing the Civil Rights Act. That's it. Maybe it's not enough time. Those attitudes get passed down generationally.
Lieutenant Ben Kelso, San Diego Police Department, President of the San Diego Police Department's Black Officers Association. I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Great talking to you. I hope I really hope that people take the message, all right, and just kind of, just absorb it. Just think about it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jeff.
And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.